Welcome back. Next, we have a panel on environment shaping design. We will hear from Christine Edstrom O'Hara, professor in landscape architecture at California Polytech State University, Mark R. Eischeid, associate professor of landscape architecture at the University of Oregon, and Roger J. Crum, professor of art history at the University of Dayton. The panelists will give their presentations, and then we will have a moderated question and answer session with Anthony Reed, archivist at the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site.
So welcome and thank you very much. And I wanted to also thank the organizers of this event that have just done a terrific job of keeping us all together, and at a very beautiful site too. So thank you. We're moving on to discussion of residential properties. And so mine is called the Olmsted Brothers in California, where I live, and the values and practices of a new century. So the Olmsted Brothers are best known for their East Coast work. However, the firm designed or consulted on over 200 projects in California, including 57 residential projects. This was between 1912, 1933. And California actually ranks as one of the top 5 states of their whole portfolio. So it's a significant state in terms of the prolificness of this particular firm. What you're going to see in this discussion is really an evolution of style, how the firm moves from a much more formal design initially, but then later moves into California regionalism. And these changes, I argue, can be seen in their residential projects. The main designers for California included the principals John Charles Olmsted, Frederick Olmsted Jr., and Fred Dawson, who did the design here at Planting Fields, as well as associate George Gibbs. Collectively, they would hire experts in the field to help them begin to understand the sites they were working on, but they would also design and manage the projects and clients in the American West. John Charles would help with the early part of the 20th century until, of course, he passes away in 1920. These green dots that you're seeing here represent Olmsted projects in the United States. And while most of the Olmsted Brothers projects were developed in their Brookline, Massachusetts office, in 1922, the firm opens a West Coast office to manage their growing work that they've got in the region. Initially, it was located in Redondo Beach, which is in the Los Angeles area, and soon after that, they moved the office to nearby Palos Verdes Estates. From father to sons, they would use and share these same values. One of them is connect people to nature within the city. They were definitely not anti-city people. Designed regionally by responding to the conditions of the site, which we'll see is particular for California. And then, when possible, conduct environmental restoration through the design. So that would be that design wasn't a standalone, but actually design work to restore particular projects. So it was always kind of an add-on by the firm. But what would be different in California? One thing that's important to understand is the ecology of much of the California coast and its Mediterranean climate. It's one of only 5 Mediterranean climates in the world, including Chile in South America, the Mediterranean basin of Europe, the tip of South Africa, and a small part of Western Australia. So it's a very small set of ecologies. And what is characterized by all of them is a low amount of rainfall, which is typically about 15 to 21 inches of rain. It's all dropped in the winter with a rainless, dry summer. And so for the Olmsted Brothers, when they design in other places in the United States and elsewhere, a more typical climate pattern would be to have some type of year-round precipitation. So a different way of thinking about water. So in California, we have not only the issues with water, but also grave danger with fire. The Olmsted Brothers' first foray into design in California was in 1903 in a consultation for the development of Catalina Island, which is off the coast of Los Angeles. And this is a site that lacked fresh water. John Charles visited the site and really loved the native landscape that he saw there and had some ways of how to reduce water in this particular landscape. Beyond simply building reservoirs, he said that they could collect off of the roof water of these tanks that were set in the ravines. They could also use salt water for the sewer. And then he argued that the ornamental pools that were located down towards the base of these hills, which were pleasure grounds, could be refed with the tidal pools coming in and filling these places with salt water. He also discussed in 1903 subterranean irrigation, something that would be underground irrigation that wouldn't have a lot of evaporation from this dry climate. Two early residential subdivisions were in the San Francisco Bay Area in 1912. One was St. Francis Wood and the other Lakeshore Highlands, each of them with really different intended residents. For St. Francis Wood, it was a high-end residential, while Lakeshore Highlands was intended for middle-class residents. And this was an opportunity for the firm to work with two top developers, Duncan McDuffie and Walter Lemert, who became longtime clients for the firm. And while the Olmsted brothers were already expert in community design, the climate, the plants, and the water would once again test their expertise in the region. And kind of an irony is that these two developers in many ways mentor the Olmsted brothers of how to develop in California. There'd be new considerations for irrigation, for example, but also drought-tolerant plants and how to work with steep topography. Both the developers were controlling the style of their particular projects. But when we look at some feedback on the Olmsted brothers' master plan for Lakeshore Highlands, Walter Lemert is very critical in that he said that the firm had not studied the site very well, that they had pulled mature trees in the design of the main road going in. They also, both developers, asked the Olmsted firm to design roads that were much deeper than what they preferred. But the reason for it is that they weren't unsafe when there's no snow. And then lastly, both of the developers in the letters talk about do not put lawn in the right-of-way because it's constant maintenance and constant irrigation. So it's a different kind of a climate that they're going to have to work with. When Duncan McDuffie first sent his submittals to the Olmsted brothers, he included a design of the subdivision, which you see on the right-hand side, a contour map, but also a map showing the development within a larger regional context. And this departure from the urban grid that is typical of San Francisco was a plan that was aligning to the natural contours, which we can see in that circular map on the left. The design spatially didn't match the way that the Olmsted brothers would typically design some kind of a subdivision with the curvilinear road layout. But when Fred Dawson visited the site, he was amazed by how well Duncan McDuffie understood the environmental conditions. He said that the symmetrical layout was well-founded, and that Dawson, in this Egypt approach, he said that it could be understood in the map, but there were a lot of unreadable parts of the landscape that he felt McDuffie had really understood how to put the subdivision into the site that would work well for the future subdivision. For McDuffie, he was uninterested in speculative projects, and his focus wasn't on social reform. Rather, he was committed to this permanent development that would adapt to its existing conditions. Perhaps his expertise came from the fact that he was an environmental activist and also an avid outdoorsman as his way of understanding the landscape. Designed during this country place era, you can see in the Olmsted drawings and later the photos that we can see on the right-hand side, the design of St. Francis Wood was very formal in its style, in its details, and stylistically not particularly regional to California. When we look at designs like this, the neoclassical forms, really these designs could have been anywhere in the United States. The European influence formality, however, was softened by the Olmsted brothers' arts and crafts layout of the plants. And so the largely purple, pink, and white, which you can't really tell in a black and white photo, but you can from the planting plans, this kind of soft pastel color palette was lush. You can see it expanding across the paths and really softening the geometry. And in these no-lawn rights-of-way, we can also see the much more compositionally interesting layout that they got when they began to connect the site and the architecture. While designing St. Francis Wood, the Olmsted brothers also designed McDuffie's personal estate that's in Berkeley. working on this project actually for over 20 years. The early designs in many ways speak to McDuffie's preference for those formal designs that you saw in St. Francis Wood. For example, that pool design, which we can see on the upper left, that was designed by C.H. Walker, was extremely formal. And then the location of it, you can see it in the right-hand slide, was laid perpendicular to the house. So for the Olmsted brothers, they end up creating this way to connect the pool, this kind of cool pool structure, back to the house through a series of locally cored stone walls, flagstone paving, pots, which we can see in the foreground, and an Italian cypress that kind of echo the Italian and Spanish designs. McDuffie's formal design garden, which we can see these drawings by the Olmsted brothers in 1914, they designed this enormous symmetrical staircase with the formal balustrades, evenly placed potted plants over the posts, and it looked to the Italian Renaissance elements for this seemingly ostentatious design, given the bucolic nature of the Berkeley landscape at the time. And I would argue, too, that the Olmsted design didn't match the architecture of the house, which we can see to the left. There was really no sort of connection of the landscape and the architecture in this particular design. Working at the same time on a design for W.H. Cowles that's in Santa Barbara, the firm designed a similar formal set of elements, close in same time period for both clients. But obviously the Cowles estate is much less grand, yet it uses that same vocabulary of the stairs, of the walls, but keeps that view open in Santa Barbara to the San Ynez Mountains. The Olmsted brothers used Mediterranean plants on all of their California designs, but at this time you see that their built elements lack that regional response that would change significantly in the next 10 years. Oops. There we go. So the McDuffie estate would eventually develop into a large estate by the 1920s and blend the formality into a much more California design expression. McDuffie built a new house, this one designed by Willis Polk, and was a Spanish colonial revival design. The earlier formal rose garden and large vegetable garden that we can see on the western side of the property terraced down the slope. The house is up on the east side of the landscape, and we can see a new set of patios and terraces and water features that extended in connection with the house, and we can see that in the photos on the right-hand side. These ones, to me, feel much more human scale than the previous designs and spoke to the regional historical Spanish character of California. This pergola replaced the earlier massive structure that they had in that place. That was where the pool was, with dark wood beams and a minimization of detail in the posts. Between the house and the garden, they also reduced the size of the lawn in a place that doesn't get a lot of water and changed the palette to one of drought tolerance. Duncan McDuffie loved plants, and he didn't choose plants that were drought tolerant until the 1920s, when California experienced another well-known drought. We've got a lot of cycles. We've recently had some droughts where we had 4 to 6 inches of water for the year. So that is a lot of water to put on your landscape if you don't have it. But there were other influences that were changing California design. In 1915, the Panama California Exposition in California focused on regionalism, and it was the combining of architecture, landscape architecture, and planning in how to design for California. The Olmsted brothers were involved in the initial exposition designs in 1910, 1911, before resigning for political reasons, which is part of a longer story. And the architects at the time were also looking for a California type of architecture, one that would be definitive for the region. After the Olmsted brothers left San Diego, the new landscape design team created a heavy water design, one that showed that in California, anything can grow with a lot of water. But architects began to embrace this new sense of history and regionalism and move away from neoclassical design into one that has much more of a California expression. For the Olmsted brothers, their early work in San Diego actually helps them on their next large project that they're going to have. That's in Palos Verdes and back in Los Angeles. This would also be a long-term project. They didn't see it was going to be one. John sent Fred Dawson out to kind of talk to the client. And it actually is a pretty interesting project for the firm, as I'll go into. Initially, the site was 16,000 acres, but it was mostly former ranch land and farmland. So you can see that kind of denuded landscape when you have a lot of cattle on your land. They began research here in 1914, and because of World War I, there was a lot of time with no construction in order to get a lot of research done. So it gave them time to research the environment, from water to topography, plants, soils, fire, all of these issues, and eventually they have learned about earthquakes. Olmsted said the appeal of Palos Verdes as one that's both a place to live and enjoy life, but more on the class with the desert than with the coast. New Yorker Frank Vanderlip was the developer at Palos Verdes Estates, and he knew the Olmsted firm because he had designed his landscape at Beechwood in Scarborough-on-Hudson, New York, when he purchased it in 1906. Vanderlip would make the Olmsted brothers the directors of design, which gave them a kind of a smaller role in the project, in that they were to do the community's layout, roads, and direct an on-site nursery, which they end up doing a lot more than that, actually. Vanderlip had his own initial ideas for what Palos Verdes should look like, but he really trusted the Olmsted firm to give them this idea of developing a regional expression for California. This is the first construction at Palos Verdes, called La Venta Inn. This is the sales office, which makes sense that this is your first building. And it's sited in a way that it's overlooking the Pacific Ocean. You can see the Santa Monica Mountains in the distance. And what's significantly different in this community than any other that the Olmsted firm would design is that in a contractual agreement with Frank Vanderlip in 1922 or 3, Frederick Olmsted Jr. and Fred Dawson were required to move there while it was under construction. So it made a big difference for the first time that the Olmsted brothers were both the designer and members of the community. Due to that long-term research and move to Palos Verdes, the Olmsted brothers' work became much more innovative. They propagated the plants there, ones that didn't need a whole lot of water. They also removed many of the lawns or reduced their scale, especially in the commercial areas. They graded the roads in a way that storm drains weren't needed, so that they had a cross slope that would water to the side of the road and water the plants along its edges. They also were terracing, we saw on the last one, was part of their aesthetic. Here, it would actually have an ecological purpose, and that was to create the terraces to reduce erosion during heavy winter rains. The concern for fire was also a factor, and Dawson talked about how the building setbacks and the requirement that 30% of the lot be allotted to green space was one way that they could act as a fire break. I think another factor that influenced the design was the inclusion of an art jury. The jury was made up of design professionals, initially including Fred Dawson, who approved or recommended changes in architectural or landscape architectural design to ensure that the building and landscapes conform to this established ideal that they had set up for their community. And also, while there were some residents that were very large that were going in, many of them were quite modest by today's standards in terms of scale of these homes. The planting design, as we see in these photos, would be subtropical with a very different type of built environment. One Olmsted Brothers design was for A.E. and Winifred Cameron. This was their residence where Adrian E. Cameron became the director of the Palos Verdes Homes Association. The architectural style of the home would be considered regional, with its Mission Revival style of white stucco, red tile roof, and that really simple detailing. And this 11-room house, designed by Kirtland Cutter, was voted the best house design of 1924. Here we can see a much more modest interior shaped by Spanish influences in wrought iron, arched ceiling, stucco walls, and the hand painting that's above the fireplace. Part of the planning at Palos Verdes was the creation of irregular lot lines. That were working with the topography of the site. It's very, very steep. So the house we can see, I don't have a good pointer now, but it's sited for ocean and mountain views. In this part of Palos Verdes, you can see both the mountains, and in the winter you can see you can see the ocean, but also snow-covered mountains at the same time. The house was located in that area, but with a very small lawn. There's a 600 square foot lawn in front. And the darker shading is showing the use of locally quarried Palos Verdes stone. So we're going to use a local stone. The kind of southeast terracing is like a formal layout of the gardens on its way down. There's also a pool set inside that courtyard where the intention was that the water from the pool would be piped to the lawn area as gray water. So this is in 1920. George Gibbs was the designer on this one, and we can see in that section that he told Mr. Cameron the retaining walls were to serve as protection against wind, but also because of drought and inundation, and that these walls would prevent erosion from winter rains and begin to control some of the water flow. This is the enclosed courtyard when the house was first built, and it looks a bit empty, but you can see that the firm has changed what would be typical of a lawn in those interior courtyards into one that's primarily hardscape, matching many of the courtyard designs you'd see in a place like Spain with a greatly reduced use of water. That was in high contrast to the outside around the edges of the building, where most of the planting there was lush and informal, with the plant palette medium to low water. Many of the plants were taken from the local nursery where they're propagating the plants on site. This style of planting was typical for the firm. Seems like everywhere that they worked with that informal set of informal set of grouping, but just changing the plants to make it match where they were working. And this is it by 1928. You can see the mature landscape and the beginning of settling that house into the site. As the principal of the Olmsted brothers, how did Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. design his residence? His house location was within the community restrictions, required that it be white stucco, red tile roof. It was designed by the architect Myron Hunt, and it recalled a California ranch architecture of the 1830s. So it was looking again to a sense of regionalism in the design. He would add the dark wood details that we can see in these photographs, and he would also lay out the house in a way that it caught the ocean breezes, which began to cool down the house. Olmsted's landscape design also included this indoor-outdoor connection with the building and the landscape design. He added a vegetable garden, he added fruit trees, which easily grow in this particular climate. He also planted or built windbreaks, because you can see he's perched on the side of this cliff, which you can see cliff dropping to 150 feet down to the sea. So he's on this cliff edge where he's trying to protect against wind. Lawns, on the other hand, were planted in front of the house where that cliff is, behind the house in the terraces, and also in the paths. So as the firm did throughout all of their development, he incorporates Palos Verdes stone into the walls and the stairs to link the design back to the site. Age 56 years old at this point, we can see Olmsted photographed in his garden. The garden was planted with many drought-tolerant plants in the firm's preferred lush layout. And in the image on the left, you can see the posts being constructed to enclose the terrace garden. And then while Olmsted removed most lawns in the commercial area, he did include them in residential design, and it makes you wonder why. He doesn't really say in any of the letters. Maybe lawns are easier to maintain and water at a smaller scale. His own lawn, in my professional opinion, included copious amounts of lawn, where a more appropriate kind of surface, not having grass paths, would be decomposed granite or something else that doesn't need constant maintenance. Because in California, you have to mow and water, artificially irrigate lawns year-round, basically. In 1930, during the Depression and slowdown in construction at Palos Verdes, Olmsted decided to return with his family to the East Coast. But he had one more important environmental lesson to learn. In 1933, nearby Long Beach had a major earthquake, and a large chunk of his yard fell into the ocean. In repairing the damage, cribbing was used to retain the slope and protect the house, which had become dangerously close to the edge. But he writes in an introspective letter in the 1940s that the collapse was due to the geology of the soils that are along that cliff edge, and that when questioned as to whether he sited the house too close to the edge, he said no. He said he and Sarah had enjoyed that view, and he was willing to take that level of risk. So how can the Olmsted brothers work in California inform 21st century design and our values? In an age of remote work, it speaks to the importance of having feet on the actual ground and in-depth research before beginning design. Like Olmsted Sr., he taught the firm that design response has to be unique to its environment, and that the Olmsted brothers' maturation in their design in California is really significant. Do I think that living on site made a difference? Yes. I think that there's a sense of nuance, that people begin to understand the ecology, the culture, while they live there. Missed opportunities, I think, when as a landscape architect, you go to occasional site visits, but don't actually understand some of the in-depth portions of it. In California, the firm had to plant for drought and inundation, and here they began to develop in the 1920s a truly California landscape architecture.
So I also want to thank, thank you. I also want to thank Planting Fields Foundation for the organization of the events this weekend. I've been impressed by its organization and the events so far. And I thank you for letting me attend and inviting me to come. So it was not uncommon for the Olmsted firms to identify, preserve, and highlight views to distant landscape features in their designs, regardless of project type. And so it is no surprise that this approach was present in their residential work in the Pacific Northwest. Views to distant cities, bays, rivers, valleys, hills, and mountain ranges were among a number of features highlighted in their Pacific Northwest portfolio. Yet unique to the Pacific Northwest was the highlighting of volcanoes, an opportunity not present in their work elsewhere in the United States. As the principal who developed the Olmsted Brothers firm's practice in the Pacific Northwest, John Charles Olmsted, henceforth just Olmsted in this presentation, was clearly enthralled with the Cascadian volcanoes, as evidenced in letters, site visit reports, and design plans. Mounts Baker, Rainier, St. Helens, Adams, Hood, and Jefferson were important landscape features to Olmsted. He described these peaks through a number of superlatives: extremely beautiful, glorious, great, grand, and tremendous. This talk explores how views of the Cascadian volcanoes were highlighted in designs by Olmsted and compares his approach with that by later designers in the Pacific Northwest. The volcanoes of the Pacific Northwest, like Mount Rainier, as you see here in the slide, constitute the Cascade Volcanic Arc, a series of major volcanoes stretching north from Northern California to British Columbia. Volcanoes like these can be the source of numerous geologic hazards, including lava flows, ash clouds, lahars, pyroclastic flows, debris flows, landslides, and oh my, earthquakes, with impacts felt as much as 1,000 miles away. Given such far-reaching impacts in both space and time, these volcanoes have played a central role in indigenous narratives. Volcanoes, maybe especially those in the Pacific Northwest, are arguably sublime landscape features. Edmund Burke defined the sublime in the 18th century in one sense as, quote, whatever is fitted in any sort to excite the ideas of pain and danger, end quote. In particular, it is the size of these volcanoes, and you can maybe just catch the outline of Mount Rainier in the distance, and this almost invisibility in the photographs, which you'll see later, is a point I'll return to briefly. But in particular, it is the size of these volcanoes towering over the rest of the Cascade Mountains, piercing through the clouds, that satisfies one of Edmund Burke's sources of the sublime, that of magnitude. In Immanuel Kant's early work on the sublime, he notes that, quote, the sight of a mountain whose snow-covered peak rises above the clouds, among other experiences, arouse enjoyment but with horror, end quote, and is therefore indicative of the sublime. Conventionally, landscape architecture also has recognized the sublimity of the natural landscape. For example, in their introduction to the study of landscape design, Henry Hubbard and Theodore Kimball explained that, quote, sublimity, grandeur in landscape is commonly the result of the perception of the vast size or power or duration of the manifestations of nature in comparison with the insignificance of man or humans. It is most commonly produced, therefore, by the extent of the landscape or the size of some object in it, a great cliff or a range of mountains or a vast plain or the sea, or perhaps a forest of giant trees, end quote, or, undoubtedly, volcanoes. As is true for any project today, the earliest task requested by Olmsted of the homeowner was to secure an accurate topographic survey. Some of the topographic surveys, as noted on this slide, include detailed bearings of views to distant volcanoes. I haven't yet found evidence to show that Olmsted specifically requested this information of the surveyors, but it would not be hard to imagine that he did so, especially since his first site visit to just about any property, often made prior to any surveys being conducted, often identified views to distant volcanoes. In one report of a site visit with a prospective client, Olmsted remarked, quote, they, the client, have had it in mind to place the house diagonally so the lawn front would face about southeast, or perhaps easterly. Their idea seemed to be to compromise between the Mount Hood view and the Mount St. Helens view, but they hadn't studied the angles accurately. If the client was interested in pursuing the ideas presented in his initial report, usually a multi-page text-only document, which served as the first phase of his residential projects, Olmsted and his office would prepare a preliminary plan, an example of which you see here, usually single sheet without any additional graphics such as sections and perspectives. Olmsted usually tried to align the homes and garden spaces with and affording views of distant cascading volcanoes. And you'll see here for the failing residents in Portland, views from the living room oriented towards Mount Hood, towards the upper part of the image. In a letter to another client, C.E. Ladd, whose house had already been built, Olmsted implores, quote, evidently your house has been located in such a way as to command the views of the Willamette River and of the distant mountains, particularly Mount Hood. Permit me to say again that there is no other matter connected with your place that begins to be of such importance as this one of revising your plantations, your planting, so as to make the most of the river and distant view, end quote, of Hood. In this case, for the Lewis residents, you'll see views, two views, both from the center line, the house to Mount Hood, towards the middle of the image, and then down below the center line of these garden spaces, also aligned with views, or a view to Mount Hood. One project in the archives documents the lengths to which the firm studied views to cascading volcanoes using a number of representation techniques. And that is the project that you see here of Thornwood, located on the edge of American Lake in Lakewood, Washington, near Tacoma, and is now an inn and wedding event venue. In a letter to his colleague, Fred Dawson, Olmsted notes, quote, the imposing character of the view toward Mount Tacoma. And Mount Tacoma approximates one of the indigenous names for the peak we probably know as Mount Rainier. While these images are from a different residence, they do prelude an image for Thornwood. And one of the representation techniques used by the designers is, of course, or was used, was, of course, sketches. and the digital archive includes some of these for various projects. Shown here are those for the R.W. Lewis residence, and there are a number of different Lewises in Portland, so that might be confusing, showing framed views of Mount Hood. Note that the images here are shown in their original orientation on the page, likely for internal conceptualization purposes. So you can imagine the designer rotating the page to fit the sketch into blank gaps on the sheet. Sketches were also used to present ideas to the client, as you see here for Thornwood, helping them to imagine the visual experience of being in their future garden. As noted by Eugene Clute in a 1928 Pencil Points article on landscape drafting in general, and applicable here in this situation for Thornwood, quote, "In these sketches, the designer creates a pictorial composition. For in landscape work, one of the objects is to bring into being a series of pleasing pictures that unfold before the eyes of the observer as he or she moves about the grounds, pictures that are realized in construction and in planting," end quote. One of the surprises I found were images, photography of models made by the Olmsted firm. Here, again, of Thornwood, of an enclosed garden with a view out to Mount Hood. This next view shows the, whoa. The Olmsteds were pretty digitally savvy. Anyway, sorry. And so here, this image shows the deceit of that previous image, where the backdrop of Mount Rainier, in this case, or Mount Tacoma, is shown off to the side, away from the model. Another thing that happened, and this goes back to the second slide, how difficult it is, even today, to photograph peaks from a distance. And this was true certainly for the Olmsteds. And there's a lot of photography in the archives that has them trying to take pictures of either sites before the design or after the design, but with the focal peak in the distance difficult to see. And so here, someone, I don't know who it was, had to have labeled the mountain, which is really the raison d'etre of the orientation of the garden and the distance, and not just kind of outlining it, but, you know, in caps, labeling it mountain. This was seen in a number of other views. This is for the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition on what was then and now the campus of the University of Washington. And you can hopefully faintly see in these, on the screens, in pencil, the outline of Mount Rainier added to these photographs. And sometimes, even in some cases, I think in the lower left, that pencil outline actually continues too far on the right and is over the midground, as it were, as if to really create a certain confusion about how far away that mountain is. Another unusual, to me at least, instance of having to work with the inability to image the mountain or the peak in the distance, the volcano, is this image. And the caption is pretty funny itself. In the bottom it says, "Mountain has been put in and not in true position, axis of garden, center of mountain." And so it almost begins to suggest that maybe somebody put the mountain in the wrong place rather than the garden was incorrectly located. But the mountain in itself has been added to the image in some way, either painted on the negative or another painted on a transparency that's possibly been sandwiched as part of the development process. I'm not a professional photographer, and those two techniques were suggested to me by my colleague Ann Godfrey at SUNY ESF, who is both a landscape architect, academic, and photographer. And I showed her this, and that's what she suspected might have happened here. Even when it was difficult to image these volcanic peaks in the distance, photographs of Thornwood, for example, in magazine articles like you see here, would have still referenced the opposite view, noting that behind the photographer was a focal volcano in the distance. Today at Thornwood, as the result of subdividing, selling of lots, houses and vegetation built up behind this walled garden, that view is no longer evident. However, there is one project that you can visit today that does have that view evident, and that is the Peter Kerr residence, now owned by the Episcopal Church in Oregon. For the house of Peter Kerr and his family, Olmsted considered the view of Mount Hood from Kerr's property, quote, grand. Yet, end quote, but Olmsted had some difficulty convincing Kerr that the view to Mount Hood was worth highlighting. Olmsted thought Mount Hood, despite being tens of miles to the west from the property, was, quote, a far more important feature than his lawn or any attractive architectural formal layout. He, Peter Kerr, the client, did not care so much for Mount Hood as he had got so used to it, he did not feel the need of facing the windows directly toward it. In this scheme, I, Olmsted, said the living room would be at the south end of the house, but related accurately to the Mount Hood view. End quote. Yet Olmsted himself never seemed to get used to the view of the cascading volcanoes. Such views didn't merely impact window placement and garden design, but the planning of the entire site itself. In a letter to the client, Kerr, Olmsted noted, quote, with respect to the new house site, my feeling was that in spite of the manifest advantages of a site close to the bluff, the distant view would be more agreeable from a house site further back from the bluff. The distant view, because in that case you could provide a picturesque foreground on your own place and could so manage the plantations as to conceal the sordid little houses of the town of Milwaukee across the river, while still retaining in full view the wooded hills beyond and the magnificent view of Mount Hood. And so this is the rear facade of that house by Portland architect Ellis Lawrence, and the view is towards the right in this image, as you see here. So there is essentially framing on three sides by two trees, including their canopies, and in the distance, the bit of white right above the hill profile is the peak of Mount Hood. Zooming in a little bit, maybe you can see it a little bit better there. But this full framing, not just the sides and not just by the ground, but also over the top of Mount Hood is something unique, at least to me, to this site. I love this photo, and there's lots to unpack here. But this is in the archives, the Olmsted archives, on a different project, as noted in the caption. But the Pacific Northwest is truly a sublime landscape, and not just because of its volcanoes. Massive trees, subduction zone earthquakes, tsunamis, and sneaker waves are all part of the experience of living in the Pacific Northwest. Everything may be big in Texas, but I don't think there's anywhere more sublime in the U.S. than the Pacific Northwest. The common perceptual experience of Cascadian volcanoes is often within the context of a larger landscape, rising above the foothills of the Cascades amidst a large fluvial plain. As a viewer, you may not understand the relationship between these landscape features, but you likely understand that there is a relationship. You may not understand how volcanoes are created, but you understand that they do not appear magically, fully formed instantaneously. Instead, they are the manifestation of millions of years of tectonic processes, building very slowly over long periods of time. Olmsted was not the only designer to frame views of the Cascadian volcanoes. In this case, the framing of views of Cascadian volcanoes reframes our aesthetic experience of them. The arboreal frame hides the landscape context in which the volcanoes exist. The frame simultaneously obscures the absolute scale of the sublime object, while also creating a sense of relative scale, allowing the volcano to be comparable to the scale of a garden element and therefore the scale of the human. This framing removes the magnitude and grandeur of the volcano, reducing it to a two-dimensional object devoid of the power to terrify. This framing converts a sublime landscape feature into a picturesque garden element. And when photographed, this view is doubly converted. The photographic frame reinforces the arboreal frame, picturesquizing, an old word, the sublime twice. So how does this compare with later design approaches to cascading volcanoes? I'll show you a few examples. This house by John Yon for lumber magnate Aubrey Watzik and Watzik's mom was one of Yon's first commissions and was quickly identified as exemplary of a developing Pacific Northwest architectural modernism and was soon profiled in the Museum of Modern Art's 1939 Art in Our Time exhibition. This site plan equally identifies a number of possible views from the guard behind the house, whether it's Mount St. Helens, Mount Hood, the Willamette Valley, and the Tualatin Valley as well. But as this plan, at least I can assure you, foretells, only one view remains in the current experience of the house, that to Mount Hood. You see an arrow to the lower right corner of the image pointing to that view. Probably the most famous photo of this project highlights the formal, as in form, relationship between the roofline of the house and the profile of Mount Hood in the distance. Once behind the house, the view of Mount Hood remains. You see a glimpse of it in the lower right-hand image, though partially obscured by the growth of vegetation. Yet in contrast to the previous projects in this presentation, this is a relatively, or at least less framed view. While this approach decontextualizes Hood to a lesser degree than that seen at Elk Rock, the previous image or project, and Fur Acres, the focus does still remain on one volcano. But what of the opportunity that can exist in Portland of seeing three volcanoes, Hood, Adams, and Mount St. Helens, at once and panoramically? In this house by Pietro Beluschi, rather than setting the house kind of towards the back and away from the slope face, as at Elk Rock, the house is set as far forward on the lot as possible. Significant glazing on the western facade, which is out of the view in the upper image, allows for a panoramic view of, if you can just maybe see it, from left to right, Mount St. Helens, Mount Adams, and Mount Hood. Such a panoramic view more closely approximates our experience outside these gardens, retains the sublimity of the volcanoes, and avoids reducing them to a picturesque element in the garden. Such a view allows for an aesthetic appreciation on the volcano's own terms. I'm going to show you just two more projects quickly of much more recent works of landscape architecture. These are two public parks by Two Ink Studio that show yet a different way of engaging with volcanoes. This 16-acre park for a diverse neighborhood in Northeast Portland has directed views as opposed to framed or unframed or panoramic views. Directed views to Mount Hood and Mount St. Helens. And you can see this even in the layout of the plan. Note the long LA, which is aligned with a view to Mount St. Helens towards the northeast. And then there's a sort of secondary axis below the soccer field down to the lower left that points to Mount Hood to the right. One of the views of Mount St. Helens, which you see here. Lewitt, by the way, is a native Cowlitz word for Mount St. Helens. So this is Lewitt View Park. And this is down that LA to Mount St. Helens in the distance, as well as the secondary axis to Mount Hood, nestled in between two distant trees. The final project I want to show you is Cully Park, same firm, also with directed views to Mount St. Helens and Mount Hood. Hood you see here alongside a path and a circular gathering area framed by wood poles. Mount St. Helens, directed view using these basalt columns that cascade down a short slope towards a soccer field. Fortunately, it stops at the soccer field. And then a little off-kilter view of Mount St. Helens off of an outlook. Final slide. Each type of view portrayed in this presentation, framed, unframed, panoramic, and directed, is a borrowing of distant scenery for design purposes in the tradition of Japanese shake or the notion of Humphrey Repton's concept of appropriation. And each view engages with volcanoes in different ways and impacts our experience of them. Yet these views can also be reflective of larger cultural values, whether it is to control or make into a picture, to appreciate fully, or to raise awareness, as in the last two projects. These approaches aren't just simple design techniques operating outside of a cultural vacuum. Instead, the types of views portrayed here are both catalysts of experience and reflections of our cultural landscape values, creating a feedback loop between society and landscape, between design and experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Christine. It is a pleasure and a distinct honor to be here. I thank you all for making this possible for me. We are here to situate the residential projects of the Olmsteds and their firm, These Ambitious Men. I am here, probably more brash than they, to unseat or query what we mean by residential, and more importantly, what a now sepia-toned Olmsted once hoped for that term. My specialization is not Olmsted, but Renaissance Florence. Maybe the closest I should ever have gotten to an Olmsted Symposium is this photograph. It marks the Mona Lisa in New York at the Met, adjacent to Central Park, 1962. Understanding this woman requires underscoring the mesmerizing landscape behind her. It is a metaphor for her mesmerizing self, nature not as specific place, but imagined environment for reimagining a life. It's not unlike Olmsted's Park. Mona Lisa never made it into the park, let alone to my Dayton, Ohio. But she might have gone there had she known that decades before Saul Steinberg saw little of value west of the Hudson, the Olmsted firm had produced a small gem in Dayton. There they reshaped this land as landscape, bringing just a bit of mystery, or at least mist, to the Midwestern. Here is history's first pairing of Dayton's Hills and Dales Park, an Olmsted masterwork, and Leonardo's masterpiece. The Olmsteds came to Dayton no less than 153 times. Mostly they came on the commissions of John H. Patterson, president of National Cash Register. They didn't design his residence, the Far Hills. Patterson really didn't regard this home as a private residence to surround or barricade with showplace plantings. No, he saw the Far Hills for the edification of others. Here, an event for his employees. Patterson's factories were not far in the distance. It was outward from the Far Hills that the Olmsteds collaborated with Patterson on a multi-part project. That project was in aid of Patterson's larger sense of home, his grander sense of responsibility to Dayton, to National Cash Register, and to the wooded south of his city. Recalling Olmsted's mantra of communitiveness, the firm worked with Patterson in radiating, really cultivating this more liberal sense of home. They joined Patterson in a credo about living well and democratically through nature in, around, and about the land across Dayton. Here is Patterson exercising this credo on horseback over the very land he would reshape with the Olmsteds. Their joint story is of place and space, but it is also of time. Though dissipated, it went all the way to the green grass but generic culture of Dayton's own Irma Bombeck. More recently, their story has returned from the suburbs to a very challenged Dayton. More on that later. First, Dayton. Once known as the city of 1,000 factories, Dayton was probably the furthest from where one would naturally find the Olmsted aesthetic. This is why Jane Reese, Dayton's photographer of pictorialism, headed to New York, to Olmsted's Central Park, to make this photograph. At home, she found that same evanescence only on the roof of her house, artificially. Here she photographs a model among the tree boughs, faking it for the camera. The undreamy, unpictorialist city of 1,000 factories is not very far away. Enter John Patterson and the Olmsteds. Patterson's National Cash Register was on the southern edge of Dayton, local, but it was also at the intersections of the world, as this ad suggests. The register and the Panama Canal paired, cash flow and flowing connection, one ocean to another. If anything linked the Olmsteds, their worldly and wealthy clients, and their residential properties, it was money and Patterson's cash registers, here monumentalized at New York's Fair of 1939. Big money, yes, but it was also the times that brought Patterson and the Olmsteds together. Patterson was a progressive-era industrialist. NCR was a Dayton company for Daytonians, thousands of them, in fact. Patterson's factories and their social services for employees were an early model of economic advancement, working hand in hand with worker enhancement and community development. Google's roots are in these gadgets. This was famously demonstrated when Patterson dedicated his company to relief after Dayton's flood of 1913. Less celebrated is how Patterson engaged the Olmsted firm in placing National Cash Register in the service of nature, coupled with the long-term health and urban-suburban connectedness of the Dayton community. Patterson was involved with the Olmsteds as early as the 1890s. Most notably, he hired the firm to design the landscaping around his factory complex. Here, Olmsted work around the buildings. Admittedly, this is not spectacular, picturesque Olmsted. Really, it is quite modest stuff, little more than shrubbery and trees about the place. But it's still that in an era when most factories were just factories. And this is decades before companies like GM would hire landscape architects to design their industrial campuses. Avant-garde, this industrial landscaping joined a set of related Olmsted and Patterson projects for encouraging urban greenery and gardens. This was particularly done in the neighborhoods of Patterson's workers and their families. Here, a tree-lined street of an Olmsted Patterson project that the firm lauded as, quote, the most beautiful street of its class in America, close quote. The Olmsteds definitely knew how to flatter their clients. This similar beauty is within eyesight of Patterson's factories. We see the influence and perhaps the Olmsted's hand, or properly hands, on the greenery about these homes. And here, in this photograph of dapper gents adjudicating a neighborhood garden competition. Finally, the Olmsted influence may also be in the work of these children at home and at the large garden plots near the factories. If the Olmsteds were not directly behind the green-thumbed industriousness of these lads, a kindred Patterson was. This all bears the imprint of Patterson's Horatio Alger-style encouragement of boys to cultivate productive gardens, to grow productive lives. Better life through gardening was Patterson's thing. Here, he himself inspects a community garden. And we even see a garden dinner on this daily schedule of our far from unbusy chief executive. Again, this is all just down the hill from Patterson's home, the far hills to the right. So too was the opening acreage of Patterson's major Olmsted commission, Hills and Dales Park, at the bottom. From 1906, Patterson owned 294 acres of substantial land south of Dayton, beginning about a mile from his residence and factories. This part of Ohio is notable for its pronounced glacial sculpting, not dissimilar from the geologic promise that natural Manhattan below held for Olmsted. What the Olmsteds did for Patterson in Dayton was to regularize these heaping geological irregularities without making anything look too regular. Classic Central Park stuff. So horse paths and hiking trails were defined, roads laid out, ponds created, and Adirondack-style shelters were placed throughout the park. As in New York, boulders are left to be boulders. Telltale Olmsted features of fieldstone walls and bridges, even a fireplace, are still in evidence, if a bit isolated or overgrown. Again, Patterson enjoyed horseback riding over this property, expecting his executives to do the same. After 1918, when Patterson gave Hills and Dales to Dayton, the city would memorialize this passion by placing this statue in the park. Here our patron is doing in bronze what he famously did in person, modeling a balance of industry and Olmstedian recreation in nature not far from the city. This mounted but egalitarian Patterson pauses more than presides over his gift and the communicativeness that was its Olmstedian design. We recall that Patterson saw his residence as connected to his factory complex, to his employees, and to his Olmsted projects in and around his factories and surrounding neighborhoods. Accordingly, he saw Hills and Dales Park as connected to, not separate from, Dayton. Here, a Dayton streetcar, not far from National Cash Register, its sign indicating an uninterrupted path from industrial but Garden City Dayton to its wooded continuation in Hills and Dales Park. It doesn't get more Olmstedian than this, except perhaps much later in views of nature, specifically of Central Park, out the window of New York's crosstown bus. The progressive era Dayton experiment of John Patterson and the Olmsteds was to envision urban social welfare through seamless industry and greenery. Their solution was to connect Dayton and its suburban reaches in and around Hills and Dales Park, so all was one continuous environment. For years, all of that was like one well-oiled machine, a social, industrial, and environmental cash register, if you will. This metaphorical register tallied up not dollars and cents, but the good sense of dollar-wise community investment. Linked by shrubs and trees, planned walkways, streets, and the horse paths, it all made of Dayton, as Patterson proclaimed, quote, a great enterprise whose stockholders are the people, close quote. That all would change. In the same era of Robert Moses, whose beltways, bridges, and byways connected but also disconnected Olmsted's New York, Dayton, here in concrete, and the rest of America experienced an encircling of highways and a hollowing out of many a vibrant downtown. With urban blight, steady white flight, and diminishing industry in sight, suburbs sprang up beyond all this and beyond Hillsdale's Park. These suburbs became ever more disconnected from all that Patterson and the Olmsteds had once connected at the junctures between industrial city and its immediate neighbor in nature. In suburbia, green grass, private fences, separate lawns, and separate lives all seemed like progress. In reality, all was a flat-platted ranch-building threat that would finally extinguish the original spark of Frederick Law Olmsted. Olmsted had walked about England, envisioning a more democratized, connected living environment. Directly or indirectly, Olmsted's vision eventually inspired John Patterson. Today, in Hillsdale's Park, a comical offspring of that inspiration and of Patterson as social welfare horseman is in this minuscule horse handle, this faux foul, pure kitsch. It adorns an Adirondack-style mailbox before a house that borders the park at the intersection of Patterson and Adirondack Trail. Now stop. This tiny horse is wholly unbridled from the meaningful past. It is disconnected from the original purpose of the place. And now it does little more than accept mail, messages, and meaning, not from here, not this green or rather Adirondack acres, but from elsewhere. About the time of this little pokey minus Gumby, our suburbanization began to seem a disconnecting mistake. The city's suburban writer, Irma Bombeck, rode her own mechanized grass-cutting horse across the disconnected Levittown-like landscape. She did so with her sarcastic mow-over about green grass and septic tanks. And National Cash Register? It fell on hard times, imploding many of its Olmstedian accented buildings into their basements. This sent dangerous toxic metals into the soil, metals that once made these gleaming registers so alluring, so the reason that the Olmsteds first came to Dayton and arguably to just about everywhere else. This environmental travesty was far from what John Patterson could ever have abided, far from what Olmsted could ever have imagined. By the time Irma Bombeck drew attention to, but really away from Dayton, to the increasing everywhere of grass and septic tanks, few remembered that the Olmsteds had ever made such a difference down that far hill in her city, once of 1,000 factories. Yet when the cash was king and Hillsdale's Park was new, these images were sent out as postcards from Dayton. As postcards, they carried a very different Olmstedian image of the city, where once one approached these factories through gardens and trees, doubtless this Olmstedian perspective got posted as far as New York in the era when the National Pavilion rose so dramatically at the '39 World's Fair. I'm focused on the greenery there. Trickle eastward, Olmsted and Patterson, would you believe? I do jest, in part, But at about the same time, these black and white photographs of back home Hills and Dales Park were made for the Federal Writers Project. They were made to illustrate the Dayton section of the project's guidebook to Ohio. Well in advance of the I Love New York campaign that once drew the world back to a recovering Big Apple, and yes, to what had become a crime-ridden Central Park, these photographs of a different Olmsted Park had drawn visitors to Dayton, Ohio. Take that, Saul Steinberg. I'm a long way from where I began, with Mona Lisa, her peculiar adjacency to Central Park. Or maybe not. Except for Lisa's few travels abroad, she has lived in Paris for so long that we often forget that she and her portrait began life in Florence. So too, centuries later, did John Singer Sargent. He was born in Florence in 1856, just a few years after Olmsted walked across England. Then, in 1895, Sargent painted this portrait of Olmsted, or is it a landscape with a portrait of the same? That ambiguity of person and plant life is the inheritance of Leonardo's Mona Lisa. Since this portrait is displayed at Biltmore, I end by arriving at a proper Olmsted residential project. I also arrive at my gratitude for your having indulged me in taking us much further afield to Patterson, National Cash Register, Hills and Dales Park, and Dayton, Ohio. Before I stop, however, I must note the abundance of privilege that this Olmsted portrait and Biltmore represent. Recall that Olmsted was appalled by privilege, by the many private grounds in England that were the selfish preserve of the luxury class. Their only advantage to the Commonwealth, he opined, really whined of these grounds, is the recreation they afford to their owners, and they number less than 1 in 6,000 of the population, close quote. Patterson truly got Olmsted, and through the latter's latter-day firm, Patterson democratized his sense of residence and shared his lands precisely with and for these everyday working-class Daytonians. Here these countless employees stand on land that NCR would later, in the 1930s, develop with the Olmsteds into a workers' recreational park. That, however, is another talk. Of course, later privilege right here in Cash Register Dayton brought about suburban flight and, yes, resulting problems. Among those, suburbanization exacerbated poverty and exposed tree inequity, the disparity in trees between affluent and poorer neighborhoods. These photographs and poster reveal that inner-city Dayton is effectively a tree desert compared to elsewhere like Hills and Dales Park and the suburbs. With this now documented, hopefully the Patterson-Olmsted example of connecting cities and nature will see a renaissance. Ironically, this poster is at my local library on Far Hills Avenue. Yes, Far Hills, a thoroughfare named for the very residence outward from which John Patterson so progressively, so treefully collaborated with the Olmsteds. Thank you.
Hi, if we can get started again. That was longer than a 15-second stretch, everyone. Back to our seats if we can. We're reconvening. We will be taking questions from the audience, but I am taking moderator's privilege for a couple of questions One is a quick one for Mark, and then the other is more for the panel. I know I'm surprising you on this one. You mentioned Mount Hood, Mount Tacoma, and the others as mountains, but refer to them as volcanoes. I've always thought of Rainier as a mountain. Mount St. Helens, obviously, prove me wrong. But what's the language between the mountain and the volcano? Is there a difference, or what can you say about that?
Yeah, I apologize for that mix-up. That's on me. They are all volcanoes or volcanic mountains. So, yeah, I should have stuck with volcanoes in all cases.
Nice. Okay.
Don't volcanoes emit things and mountains don't? I don't know.
But you can have a volcanic mountain. But yeah, anyway, all volcanoes.
They're all going to go at some point.
And they've gone before.
Right, and will at some point. So my question for the panel is, and I'll start with my friend Roger here. You used the term communitiveness a couple of times in your talk, and I know it as an Olmsted term. He probably didn't. He might have come up with it. Quick definition of it for the audience and for the panel. How this interplay between private residences and public spaces. How does that kind of play out for you? Use the mic.
Yeah, communitiveness, which I'm absolutely certain would have rolled off of Olmsted's tongue easier than it rolls off of mine. With regard to Dayton and Patterson, Patterson is absolutely and quite progressively committed to his workers and to Dayton. And National Cash Register is this extraordinary model. I just showed one image of one sort of exercise class that went on in the factory. But the very factories themselves, which work hand in hand with the Olmsted project, are very people-centered, very worker-centered. He's one of the very early industrialists who insists that his factories have large open windows for light and air to come into the factory, that the factories be made of a cheery goldenrod brick rather than an oppressive exterior design, so that there is that symbiosis of Patterson's factories, his social attitudes, the experience of the workers, and how all of that works with the pleasantry of the greenery that the Olmsted firm provides. And I'll simply end this good question with the statement that Patterson's factory was for years and years the major employer in Dayton, Ohio. And so if you're, in most cases, father, in some cases also mothers, but in most cases, if your father didn't work for National Cash Register, the neighbors' fathers did. Everybody worked for what was called the cash, and it worked 3 schedules round the clock and was just this beacon of activity and social concern and communitiveness in Dayton, Ohio.
So there's, I suppose, different approaches to answering the question. And one of the things that I learned in this research is that it was the large public projects in the Pacific Northwest that allowed for J.C. Olmsted to participate in these smaller private residential projects. So the 2 expositions in Portland and Seattle in the 1900s, the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition in 05 in Portland, and the 09 Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition in Seattle. Those were not necessarily the earliest projects that brought them out to the Pacific Northwest, but early projects. And what I found in the communications in the archives was situations where folks around town would get wind that J.C. Olmsted was in town for these exposition projects, and would call on him at the hotel he was staying at, or send him a message saying, hey, while you're out here, could you look at my place? And this happened quite a bit. So, and especially because of the distance between Brookline and the Pacific Northwest, the Olmsteds weren't going to come out just for a single-family residential project. So all these residential projects were piggybacked, especially in the early days, on the larger public works.
And then I would say in California in the 1920s, the communication for especially places like Palos Verdes, where the firm is both the designer and in the community, they were trying to show best practices in landscape architecture. How do you design with the semi-arid community? And I think that while the letters are much more demonstrative in terms of their ideas, their intention, when you look at a macro scale, I thought that it was much more difficult to figure out their intentions besides from some of the residential properties, especially Olmsted's own, because he's not writing letters to himself to talk about design intent. I also thought it was interesting too, there's kind of dissonance in terms of showing you this is what you should do versus what I'm actually doing in Olmsted's own unsustainable design. So there's, this lack of continuity as a principle of ways that you need to design in a place, but maybe appreciating his East Coast sense of aesthetics in the design.
Do as I say and not as I do. And I guess to that point, back to the sort of commutativeness, a place like Palos Verdes is a subdivision, a planned community with a higher income, say, bracket, and St. Francis would also, I believe. How community-minded is it to be developing places that aren't for all communities? I mean, Biltmore is another example of a place that is a publicly accessible park at this point for those who can afford to do so. So there is this sort of, again, cognitive dissonance of commutativeness in Central Park was black and white, Gentile and Jew, it's for everybody. And then there is sort of a flip to that of designing big, extravagant chateau in North Carolina, of all places. How does that fit for people?
But at the same time, if you look at the design of Torrance, which is within a couple of miles of Palos Verdes, this was an industrial garden city designed in 1910. That was for a very different community that Olmsted was coming out as a city planner to help lay out this new community. And kind of like what Mark was saying, if you look at the grid of Los Angeles, they take Torrance and rotate it so they have these views down to Mount Baldy, which would have been the best mountain view from that particular place. So I don't think that I think that he crossed in terms of demographics communities. And in that particular one, as a garden city, they put the residential on the western side so the ocean breezes blow those polluted factory, that smoke, away from residential. Blew it onto fields and everybody, I guess, east of the community of Torrance. But they designed for a lot of different types of communities, but I don't think he would have lived in Torrance.
Right.
As for John Patterson, he really breaks the mold of exclusivity that may have been ultimately problematic with any number of Olmsted projects, not simply with making his factories a more pleasant environment, as I've suggested, but what I alluded to in my talk is the National Cash Register then engages the Olmsted firm in the creation of what's called Old River Park, which is a major recreational park for its employees and in effect for the community. So they're long before, I think, the era of public relations and trying to curry favor with the local public, Patterson simply did it. He did it most necessarily immediately after the disastrous 1913 flood of the Great Miami River, in which he essentially stopped the operations of his factory and turned his factory, which was slightly on higher land, but had the industrial processes that could make scores upon scores of lifeboats, because such were desperately needed. And that continued later in the public goodwill around the construction of Old River Park, which, by the way, had what is reputed to have been, it no longer exists, the largest swimming pool in America, if not the world. The University of Dayton, my institution, now owns all of that property. although questions of liability and deep concerns of liability mean that the university simply will no longer let anybody use the waterway at the Old River Park. So my institution, which is deeply and sincerely committed to social engagement and community mindedness, communitiveness, perforce is required to not fulfill the Olmstedian Patterson vision of letting people play in the water as they once did in Dayton, Ohio.
Are there questions in the audience? Oh. Sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
What is the total number of landscape designs here in the U.S. as well as abroad?
Arlene has that answer. Yes.
I would say that that's a complicated question and answer because we get asked this all the time at the archives. We have about 6,000 projects that are in the general list of the firm. What's built, what's extant, what was implemented, what we have design documents. So it's a nuanced question about how we run. About 6,000 is kind of the number we throw out for the projects that are documented within the collection. Collectively. Thank you. Thank you. Someone. I'll just say while the microphone is going back there.
Follow up to that because it sort of sets me up beautifully. We saw the Sargent portrait of Olmsted. We saw old Olmsted. We saw Olmsted in the Greek sailor hat. In 3 projects like the one we're in now where senior wasn't involved at all. And so, I mean, Christine, I know you've lectured extensively on junior and others in the practice. I'm wondering here at Planting Fields, if in all coming from places where senior was not involved, are there strategies that you have found to be effective in raising the visibility and value for your legacy so that when it doesn't get published, e.g., here in Dayton, the designer of Central Park? So what is it that's being done in these places to elevate the value of someone who was not senior? And are there things that you've discovered that might be helpful here at Planting Fields so it doesn't get compared to Central Park in New York as the same designer?
Charles, are you talking about the designs that were here, or are you talking about the people who
The
designed
firm.
these places?
I mean, Olmsted Senior was dead when all of these projects were going on. So, and we saw a lot of portraits of senior, and we keep saying Olmsted. And I know that in Mark's presentation, he qualified at the beginning what he meant by that. But nevertheless, I think for the public, they just kind of mush all this together. And I think as we look at, you know, coming back, as Dee Dee suggested yesterday for the 201st anniversary, perhaps we can celebrate some other birthdays then as well.
Charles, thank you for that question. Speaking for Dayton, Ohio, which I've never done before, the name of Frederick Law Olmsted has sufficient cachet or sufficient minimal recognition leading to some cachet that I think the town, to confuse it with the wider reality of the descendants and the firm, they've not gotten there yet. And so there's local pride largely projected by the Park Service that, guess what, folks, Hills and Dales Park is connected to Central Park. And I think it's fair to say that until a fellow by the name of Roger Crum came along, nobody was talking about it beyond just that. So I think it's the cachet, but you make a very good point. Yeah, I will. I will if he ever stops talking.
And I also think that if you read the letters, you begin to figure out who was actually doing the work. You know, in places like the LA Parks Plan, that the language was really written by Olmsted Jr., if you go back to the drafts of that report. So while they're with Bartholomew and Associates doing as the planners, when you're trying to figure out who actually wrote the text of that, you can go back to these letters and see the early drafts to see who was actually the author. There's other ones where you can look at the drawings themselves and realize that Dawson's signing off on other people's work. And when I was going through Olmsted's letters for the construction of his own home, George Gibbs was drafting, the office was drafting what Olmsted said he wanted. And I thought it was interesting because I said, this is where we think you should place these things, because he's not living in California yet, so he has his ideas of where he wants to place things, but he needs someone on the ground that can actually, A, figure out where it belongs, but also do the heavy lifting of all the graphic drafting to get it built.
Wait, a little more time. One more.
For the brothers practice, is there any connection known to Ebenezer Howard, Unwin, and others, and the Garden City movement? That's maybe a way to sort of bring out what happens in the 20th century?
It was mentioned earlier this morning about Forest Hills Gardens being the first garden city designed by the Olmsted brothers in the United States. And so that's coming directly from Letchworth and other garden cities in England. But then they also did other ones, like in California, and not that much later, having an industrial garden city. So that era, Arlene, I see you want to say something because that's your home.
No, it's just that it's a very mixed bag, and certainly if you keep in mind that Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. is developing the whole sense of urban landscape, of urban planning pedagogy. So all of these are being taught, and they're underwriting his thinking about all of the land community design that they're doing. And what I'm going to refer to tomorrow, but so briefly, is the regional plan of New York. So it's there. But if I could just stand on my little soapbox once more and say...
You ever needed permission before?
What was that?
Is that on tape?
It's just
And Roger
Charles,
Crum fell silent through all of that.
it was just that Charles brought up something he's heard me yak at forever down in his ear, and that is this lumping of the Olmsteds is doing a huge disservice well, we've started with a lot of myths we've had to untangle over all these years of us doing this research. And you are now the next bevy of scholars who are beginning to unweave this rug to weave it back together. And you really have a strong responsibility to give these individuals their persona and their creative history and the direction of all of their ideas. And they're very interesting people with very interesting backgrounds. And though the mantra of the firm was to operate under the mantle of Olmsted Brothers and have it as a unified appeal, we are now pulling it apart to put it back together. But let's pull it apart.
Excellent point.
I think that is probably the time we have for this panel. I appreciate all the interaction and all the feedback, the questions, and there'll be time for more discussion as this carries forward. Thank you for the panelists, and I appreciate your time.
We got you.
Okay. And I think I have the floor for the last probably 10 minutes or so, and
Red's going back.
is this right here all right?
Thank you.
Something?
You don't need the podium?
No, I'm going to try to, that's right. Since we are running long, I'll stand here and sort of close us out. If I can have everyone's attention, please. Thank you all. And in closing, I was asked to give the last couple minutes as we finish today off, and I wanted to give some information about the Olmsted National Historic Site. And initially, I wanted to say that the homework that I didn't do for this weekend, I don't have the specific language for a proper land acknowledgement, and I know Gina discussed it this morning. But I do want to I would like to take a moment to consider that before the Olmsteds were involved, before the land was owned by Byrne and before the land was owned by Coe, it was not owned. So I do want to acknowledge the people and civilizations that lived here and moved through here, the Mattencock who were here. We appreciate their work and their time here. So as we consider grateful for the opportunity to share for just a minute the offerings of the Olmsted National Historic Site, also called Fairstead. For those who were at last weekend's Harvard GSD Symposium, the refrain of "I'm not an Olmsted scholar" may sound familiar, but for the record, I'm not an Olmsted scholar. I've spoken with a few of you about this sort of imposter syndrome I feel when surrounded by those who know the Olmstedian design principles much better than myself, but I can talk about what I do know of the Olmsted archives. I'm also grateful to see so much of our archives being used so robustly at conferences and by actual Olmsted scholars and practitioners. So if you'll indulge me a little bit about Fairstead, the Olmsted Homestead. We maintain 140,000 items in our plans and drawings collection, 60,000 photographs in our photo album collection, and an estimated 1 million documents as a whole. Of the 140,000 plans, we have digitized about 86% of them, even the large size format materials. We've digitized the entire photo albums, and those are all available on our Flickr site that you can access through information on the cards out at our table. The other aspect of our work at Fairstead is the Public Visitor Services Program, or the Public Engagement Program, offering tours of the historic office and restored landscapes, walking tours of Boston's Emerald Necklace, and other Olmsted landscapes locally, in addition to offsite programs at local institutions. The rangers do that. Brianne Cassetta is my colleague back there, the supervisory ranger, can tell you more about that. She can also talk to you more about the other major part of our public engagement program, education program, is our award-winning Good Neighbors program, written into the local third grade curriculum, teaching the next generation of landscape stewards the skills associated with environmental care, teamwork, collaboration in terms of landscape design. The last element of our work that I'd like to highlight is the efforts we make to keep the Olmsted legacy alive. Through partnerships, learning, not education, and sharing and preserving our resources, we help other great groups such as NAOP, Planting Fields Foundation, Emerald Necklace Conservancy, among hundreds of others, and individuals, too many to mention, but you know who you are, to keep the ideals of the Olmsteds a vital part of the dialogue as we move forward toward a future that seems to me fairly uncertain. But with the great work behind us and the even greater work ahead of us, I'd like to think that the previous 200 years can only be improved upon to something greater than perhaps we can really envision today. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers today, and thank you all for coming. That concludes the first day of the Olmsted Symposium. Registration opens at 9:30 a.m. tomorrow. Please bring your name tags back so we can identify you as a symposium guest. The sign-up sheet for continuing education credits is on the front table in the front hall. If you're interested in getting information about the continuing education credits, please just fill that out as you leave. Thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow.